good evening, and good night, my friends, whichever part of the world you might be. We tend to make efforts to focus and to draw attention to the Guyanese diaspora, wherever they might be. We know, as a rule, that Guyanese are scattered all over the world. Many have accomplished great things, and many are also working to ensure a better life for themselves wherever they might be. We wish them well, but we also would like you to take some time off to listen and to pay attention to what is said on these Straight Talk programs. Only last weekend, I met with a gentleman who came in from the United Kingdom, who surprised me by telling me that he enjoyed listening to these programs precisely because it brings him up to date, among other programs, with what is happening in Guyana. And that is what is badly needed by Guyanese overseas. So we try our best to provide information and by extension a service by bringing to the Guyanese, by bringing to them a political message once every week about topical issues obtaining in our homeland. This week, we will focus on a very historic figure in the history of Guyana. This program is going to be dedicated to Mistress Janet Jagan, an icon within the political situation and the political evolution of our country's history. In a few days' time, we will be celebrating the 99th birth anniversary of Mrs. Janet Jagan. Only recently, many people in many parts of Guyana have been holding small events to commemorate this event. But the question is, why speak of the dead after so many years? It is just 10 years now that Mrs. Janet Jagan has passed away. And 10 years is not a very long time when we want to reflect on someone's history such as hers. Mrs. Jagan came to Guyana in the year 1943. She lost her American citizenship because she contested in the 1947 elections that was held in the then British Guyana. So we want to reflect on Mrs. Jagan's contribution to the struggle for free and fair elections and democracy in Guyana. As always, when we speak about historic figures, we need to put it in a context, in today's context. And we need to show the relevance of speaking about that particular individual. So context and relevance is extremely important when speaking about a person who played a historic role in the struggle for Guyana's independence, for its freedom, for democracy, and for an improvement in the livelihoods of the Guyanese people. And this is where Mrs. Jagan comes in. Mrs. Jagan, as you know, was the wife of Chedi Jagan, the father of Guyana's independence. But I'd like to make it very clear. Wife has nothing to do with what she became. Being the wife of Chedi Jagan was one thing that is personal and familiar. But in her own right, she emerged as a political figure and as a woman in politics in her own right, fighting not only for women's rights, but also for the rights of all Guyanese men and women. Now let us focus on her contribution to the struggle for free and fair elections in Guyana. Because there's some in our country who may not know about Mrs. Jagan, first of all. They may not know about her contribution, secondly. And they may have been fed with so much lies, so much falsehoods, that they don't even know, or they don't even recognize the role that she played. I will not speak about the elections in which Mrs. Jagan participated in and fought in the various constituencies that obtained at the time of our electoral system, which was then called first past the post, as exists in the rest of the CARICOM countries. Guyana is the only country within CARICOM that has what is called a hybrid electoral system. That is to say, a combination of first past the post and the other electoral arrangements that have been put in place. So we have a combination of the two systems. And that is where the problems have always been ever since the electoral system was changed. Now, I will not speak, as I said before, about the 47 elections which Mrs. Jagan contested and as a result lost her American citizenship. I will also not speak about the 1953 elections, the 1957 elections, and the 1961 elections, nor the 1964. Let me repeat: 1953, 1957, 1961, and 1964. In all of those elections, the PPP contested and won. And it is precisely because of that track record that you will hear people say that so long as a free and fair elections are held in Guyana, the People's Progressive Party is bound to win. This is not rhetoric, this is not storytelling, nor these are not a fairy tale. These are facts that are proven and are etched in the history of our electoral politics. Mrs. Jagan was a member of the Elections Commission between 1967 and 1979. Those were very difficult days. The type of Elections Commission that we had then is nothing compared to what we have now. At that time it was called Elections Commission. Now it is called GECOM, Guyana Elections Commission. And at that time, the People's Progressive Party had only one representative out of 3 on the commission. You had 2 from the ruling PNC and a chairman who was identified by the president or the prime minister of the country. In those days, there was no reforms that required the president or the prime minister to consult and to gain the support of the leader of the opposition. The president, or as the prime minister in those days, would unilaterally decide who he wishes to be the chairman of the Elections Commission. And so with 3 against 1, or 1 against 3, one can very well imagine how difficult it was to get the commission to agree to recommendations and proposals put forward by the PPP representative on the commission. Now, it was during that period, 1967 and 1979, that 2 of the most despicable, if not infamous, elections were held in our country. 2 of the most fraudulently rigged elections were held between 1967 and 1979. That was the period when Mr. Jagan served on the Elections Commission. Let's talk briefly about the 1968 general elections in Guyana. Mrs. Jagan was a member of the commission. The commission was controlled by the government. The government, of course, was controlled by the ruling People's National Congress. At that time, the Prime Minister was a man by the name of Forbes Burnham, and Dr. Chedi Jagan was the leader of the PPP in the opposition, the opposition leader. The elections preparation for 1968 was dogged by many difficulties and challenges. There was, for example, a sudden increase in the number of voters on the voters list by 20%. Could you imagine the voters list increasing by 20%, the numbers of voters increasing by 20% over the 1964 number that was on the list? Now, obviously, such a steep increase in the number of persons on the list was done for a particular purpose and objective. I should point out that most of the people who were included in that 20% increase on the list for 1968 elections were bogus names, names that didn't exist, names of people who had died, names of underage persons. I repeat, the names of that 20% increase on the 1968 list for voters in the elections held that year were bogus names, names that did not exist, a person who did not exist, names of people who had died, and underage persons. In other words, the list was not only a bogus list, it was a padded voters list. But that was not all. That was not all. What was discovered by an independent television team that traveled to the United States, Canada, and England was that many of the persons who were registered, were supposed to be registered on the vote and being on the voters list, what is called the overseas voters list. And let me digress a moment here. In those elections, it was the first time that 2 or 3 varieties of voting was introduced, in addition to the normal manner of voting. There was overseas voting, there was postal voting, and there was the abuse of the proxy voting. The overseas voting, where number of people were registered to vote and to have their votes collected at the embassies and the high commissions for Guyana and sent to Guyana. An independent television team got copies of the list and visited many of the locations or the addresses where people were alleged to have registered to vote. When they visited those places, there was no one. And even when there were people in the apartment buildings, they knew no one of the names mentioned on the voters list. In some areas, there was empty house lots. In some areas, there were horses grazing on pastures. And so this became a big scandal, that the list of overseas voters was scandalous, was totally unacceptable, and was of course rejected by the then political parties, mainly the PPP at the time. There are 2 famous documentaries that one can find on the YouTube. One is called The Trail of the Vanishing Voters, and the other is called Mr. Burnham Does It Again. These 2 documentaries illustrate very convincingly how the overseas voters list was padded to the extent that it became a scandal. I would like to take this opportunity to recommend to viewers that they go on YouTube and try to locate these two documentaries. I repeat the names: Trail of the Vanishing Voters and Mr. Burnham Does It Again. I do believe that your viewing of these two documentaries will help you understand the extent to which the PNC can go to rigging elections in order to stay in government. These would be stark reminders of what we ought to bear in mind, having regard to the fact that elections are soon to be held in this country in March of next year. In 1968, apart from what I mentioned that was carried out by the PNC in order to hoodwink the voters and to stay in office, there was also instances where the ballot boxes were stuffed with ballot papers that marked PNC, that is to say, supportive of the then ruling party. In one case, one box was opened, and in that box was found a bundle of ballot papers wrapped in rubber bands. Now one can very well imagine whether that was done by magic or whether that was done by a hook or a crook. How could a bundle of more than 50 ballot papers enter in a ballot box which has a narrow slot only to accommodate one ballot paper at a time? It simply meant that the boxes were secretly opened and these ballots put into their contents. That also meant that it was hurriedly done, that the thieving or the stealing that was done in such a messy manner that the fraud could not be hidden. Ballot boxes that were stolen were found floating in the Pomeroon River by persons who live in the vicinity. When those boxes were opened, there were no ballot papers in them. And so it meant that boxes were switched. In other words, boxes containing votes, the majority of votes for the PNC, were secured, that were changed, and the boxes that had votes that were not supportive of the PNC was thrown away into the river, only to be found floating by residents who live in the Pomeroon area. That was the kind of blatant way in which elections were rigged in 1968. And my friends, we need to bear this in mind, because you know, there's a saying that history have a way of repeating itself. Or, as some others would say, those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it. Now, Mrs. Jagan was in the Elections Commission for those elections, and she fought tooth and nail to ensure that all this skullduggery that was contemplated by the PNC in order to rig those elections were thwarted and was prevented. But with electoral machinery in the hands of the government as it is now, it was almost difficult or impossible to prevent the rigging. Now it is true we could not, she could not prevent the rigging, but she could at least expose it. And exposing rigging to the nation and to the world at large is what brought the PNC regime and government into disrepute. There was no way that they could explain such a fraudulent perpetration of elections in the face of total rejection on the part of the international community and the Guyanese people. And so Mrs. Jagan, as a member of GCOM, working of course with her political party, the PPP, did a fantastic job exposing the extent of the rigging that took place in the 1968 elections. I should mention that the 1968 elections was where it all began, meaning that is where the rigging of elections began in our country. There might have been rigging before in local government elections, and there was rigging before in the local government election that was held before the 68 elections. But this particular election in 68 was the most blatant, the most barefaced, and the beginning of what was to come insofar as rigged elections in Guyana is concerned. Now, we move to the subsequent elections that were held in 1973, 5 years after 1968. In 1973, Mr. Jagan continued on the Elections Commission. She was the sole representative of the party on the commission. Nothing had changed insofar as the composition of the commission was concerned. Nothing had changed insofar as the control by the PNC of the commission was concerned. And the situation in the country continued to be dominated by a dictatorship led by one Forbes Burnham. In other words, what I'm saying, the situation in Guyana had not improved in any way whatsoever. It was going down and down economically, socially, and of course, politically. The 1973 elections was also historic, in this sense, that for the first time in Guyana's history, in elections, the military, the Guyana Defense Force, intervened in the elections, seized the ballot boxes, took them to Camp Ayangana and other military installations, and did what they had to do with the votes in those boxes. It was in some cases not only after 10, sometimes 15 hours that the boxes were eventually brought to Queen's College, one central counting place, to be counted. During the period when the boxes could not be accounted for, because we knew the exact time when the boxes left the polling stations, and incidentally at that time, there was no counting of votes at the place of poll. The boxes were sealed, boxes were collected, and in some cases taken by motor cars by the presiding officer at the polling station to the central counting place. According to the rules at that time, the polling agents of the various political parties were allowed to accompany in the same car or to follow the car with the ballot boxes being taken to the central counting station. In this particular instance in 1973, neither of those two options were allowed. The polling agents were not allowed to sit in the car with the ballot box going to the central counting place, nor were they allowed to follow the car or the vehicle taking the ballot boxes where the votes were to be counted. They were prevented from doing so by the police or the army. And so these cars were stopped, searched, and prevented from going on to follow the cars with the ballot boxes inside. And so in the 73 elections, the military, meaning the Guyana Defense Force, this was the most sordid period in the history of the army in this country, seized the ballot boxes, took them to central locations unknown to anyone where these boxes were. And in the meantime, Mrs. Jagan was on a radio station program asking one question over and over again. At that time, there was a man by the name of Sir Donald Jackson, who was the chairman of GCOM. There was a man by the name of Sir Lionel Lockwood, who was a representative of the PNC, and there were others. And she kept asking the question on the radio station, where are the ballot boxes? Could you imagine ballot boxes missing for 10, 15 hours and nobody knew where those boxes were? The whole operation was shrouded in history. And that was because steps were being taken again to switch votes in the ballot boxes, and when they were satisfied that they had the majority of votes in each ballot box, then they were taken to Queen's College, where they were all counted in the presence of polling agents who had gathered there. I was one of the polling agents, or one of the counting agents that was at Queen's College for those 73 elections, sent there by the PPP to observe the counting of the votes at that location. I witnessed soldiers bringing in the ballot boxes and then placing the boxes on large tables where they were open and the votes be counted. It's almost impossible to believe the results. The PNC got a 2/3 majority in the parliament. The majority of votes in Leg 1, the majority of votes in Wakenham, the majority of votes on the Escribo courts, the majority of votes in Berbice on the Quarantine, in Kanji, in all the PPP strongholds where everyone knew that the majority of people in those locations voted for the PPP. Would you imagine that the PNC won 80 and sometimes 90% of the votes in those locations? My friends, I know this is almost impossible to believe in today's context. But in context of those days, when rigging was the order of the day, and when rigging was the only way the PNC could survive in office, it was something that one had to recognize that was not impossible to happen once the PNC was in control of the election machinery. And so the 1973 elections also became a total disaster for Guyana. What made it even more disastrous was the fact that 2 young men on the Quarantine were shot and killed by the security forces. Now it was alleged that Mr. David Granger was the commander of the army at the time. A commission of inquiry was set up by Mr. Burnham to investigate into the shooting of these 2 young men during the elections day, or the night of the election when votes and polls were closed. The person appointed to the commission to head the commission of inquiry was a friend of Mr. Burnham. He made sure that the person who was put to chair the COI, just like now, Mr. Granger tries to make sure that anyone who chairs the COI is not unfriendly to the ruling party and the ruling APNU AFC. And so after that investigation, Mr. Granger was exonerated. It was claimed that he had nothing to do with the shooting. But the fact of the matter is that it was the GDF and the security forces that were involved in the seizure of the boxes, the intervention in the elections for the first time in our country's history. Everyone who is alive today and recall the tension that our country went through in the 73 elections would not wish our country to go through those days once again. Now, what happened after those elections was that the PNC, as I said, got a 2/3 majority in the parliament. In other words, total control of the National Assembly. They could do as they wish Parliament became a rubber stamp, and the People's Progressive Party had a very small number of seats in the National Assembly. Just imagine, the largest and most popular party at the time, and up to now, the People's Progressive Party, was reduced to a mere 12, 11 seats in the National Assembly. Of course, by fraudulent elections perpetrated by the People's National Congress. Mr. Jagan again did a fantastic job in exposing the fraud that took place in the 73 elections. And that is why we speak about her role in today's context. I again repeat that when speaking about historical figures, we put them in a context and we speak about the relevance of what they did at that time in today's context. So context and relevance is extremely important, having regard to the contribution that they made to the struggle for free and fair elections and the struggle in which we are presently engaged in, once again, for free and fair elections in our country. After the 73 fiasco with the military involvement in elections, 78 came for elections to be held again. But what happened? Mr. Burnham began discussions on the question of a new constitution. The elections in 1978 were postponed for 2 years while the discussion was going on the question of a new constitution. And instead of elections being held in 1978, they were held 2 years after, in 1980. That is, after a vote was taken in 1978, a referendum was held. In other words, instead of elections being held, general elections being held, a referendum was held in 1978 to approve the new constitution. The opposition at the time boycotted that referendum. Thousands of voters stayed away from voting at that referendum. And once again, the PNC was exposed. In 78, Mrs. Jagan continued at GCOM, and she once again exposed the fraud that took place in the 78 referendum, which gave the majority again to the PNC and postponed the elections until 1980. Elections were held in 1980. Rigging again took place in the 1980 elections under Mr. Burnham. And so the rigging of elections, which began in 1968, continued from 68 to 73, from 1973 to 1980, and so it continues. In other words, what conclusion can we draw? The only conclusion we can draw was that unless the PNC rigs elections, that is the only way they can stay in office. The greatest fear and the greatest threat to the People's National Congress, whether they call APNU, AFC, or coalition, or caretaker government, the greatest threat or fear that they have is the holding of a free and fair elections. And as many people say, that is one of the reasons why they held on, notwithstanding the passage of a no confidence vote in the National Assembly, in an effort to drag out their stay in office until 2020, which they have done. So the elections that were supposed to be held in 1978 was not held, and in its place a referendum for a new constitution was held. Elections were held in 1980, and in those 1980 elections, rigging once again took place. But I'd like to draw to you a very significant factor that makes the 1980 elections relevant in today's context. You know, they have a saying, more things change, the more they remain the same. The more things change, the more they remain the same. This week, I noticed, coming out of the discussions on the Guyana Elections Commission, now called Jagan, mention is being made about the deletion of names from the voters list because of a number of about 20,000 ID cards that have not been uplifted. What we're hearing is that the 20,000 ID cards, or the names reflected on those 20,000 ID cards that appear on the voters list, the objective is to delete those names from the list because they have 20,000 ID cards that have not been uplifted. Now a case has been made out that there's absolutely no legal connection between voting and ID cards. ID card is mainly for the purpose of identification. There's no constitutional rule or provision that says one must have an ID card in order to vote. You have an ID card as a means of identification, but not as a means to the right to vote. So we're hearing about the deleting of names because these persons who have not uplifted the ID cards, the whole idea is to take them off the voters list. Now, taking people's name off the voters list, as was said many times already, is unconstitutional. My friends, we also hearing once again that there are a number of people whose names are on the list that need to be taken off for reasons which the PNC, only the PNC knows. And this is something that we have to watch very, very carefully. So when we hear about the removal of names from the voters list, mainly because of people who do not have ID cards, we have to view that with deep suspicion. And we know that as long as the PNC is in control of the elections machinery, they are suspect. And secondly, the whole question of trust is brought to the forefront. Very few people trust the PNC in respect of the conduct of free and fair elections. And that lack of trust, that distrust, is based on the track record of the PNC in respect to elections, which I pointed out historically from '68 to this present point in time. Elections were held in 1985 after 1980. Mr. Burnham had died and Mr. Hoyt had taken over. Those elections were also rigged. Those elections were also rigged. And Mr. Hoyt found himself in hot water because many people felt that with the death of Mr. Burnham, elections would be different, but that was not to be. Elections were due in 1990, but because of a list that was riddled with so much errors, mistakes, etc., a list that was totally unacceptable by the opposition, elections were once again postponed for 2 years. Now bear in mind, this is the second time in the history of our country when elections were postponed. Postponed in '78 for 2 years until 1980. Postponed in 1990 for 2 years until 1992, when the elections were held. Are we seeing something different this time? I have heard many people express fears that what is happening now is an attempt to create confusion, an attempt to create mischief, an attempt to corrupt the voters list once again, so that elections that are due in March this year could be postponed for another period of time, perhaps 1 year or 2 years, who knows. Again, the question of trust. So we are facing a next elections. The last elections that were held in 2015, there was a lot of confusion also. And that is where the question of the fake statements of poll emerged that created the mischief and that gave the PNC the slim majority, or the slim one-seat majority, with Mr. Charandas defeated in the no confidence motion passage. My friends, in the annals of Guyana history in respect to elections, throughout the historical period of elections in this country from 68 up to her passing 10 years ago, Mrs. Janet Jagan's fight for free and fair elections remain as relevant and as useful if we are to successfully defeat the APNU AFC's shenanigans in order to rig the next elections. Now, we do not say that because we want it to happen. We are not going to clap our hands thinking that elections are going to be rigged. We have to fight. We have to fight with all our might. We have to be as alert as we can. We have to be as vigilant as we can. We have to watch them like hawks in order to see and in order to ensure that the electoral process is not compromised, that the electoral process is above board, and that in the final analysis, all the parties that will be contesting elections, not only the APNU AFC, but all the political parties that are contesting the next elections in this country, are satisfied that the conditions for elections that are free from fear, that elections that are free and fair, that those conditions are acceptable to them. And that is the fight that we ought to wage. Right now, as we speak, I do not and have not heard any of the political parties against free and fair elections. And ironically, even the ruling party, even the APNU AFC, is talking about free and fair elections. But let us not be fooled. That is like a wolf in sheep clothing coming to tell us that, look, we want free and fair elections too. But behind our backs, they are quietly and discreetly working to rig those elections in order to stay in office. Friends, as we commemorate the struggle of Mistress Jagan on the occasion of her birth anniversary, let us not forget the struggles that she waged, the lessons that we learned from those struggles, and their relevance in today's context. It is unfortunate that having fought for free and fair elections and having won free and fair elections in 1992, that we are back to square one. We are not back to square one because we brought ourselves to this situation. As some people would be heard saying on the streets, well, we have to blame ourselves because having been warned that were the APNU AFC to get into office, situation would degenerate and we would go back to where we started out. And therefore we got what we voted for. Well, this is no time for weeping and gnashing of teeth. This is no time for wringing our hands and saying we regretted it. All of that may very well be so, but that is water under the bridge. We need to dust our clothes off and move on. We need to take up the cudgels and take up the fight. The fight now is for a restoration of democracy. The fight now is for free and fair elections. And the fight now is to ensure that the people, the electorate, irrespective of which political party they support, irrespective of which race or ethnicity they belong to, irrespective of the programs and the manifestos that they support, that they must be able to vote freely and fairly at the upcoming elections. Let us be vigilant, let us be alert, and let us fight in whatever way we can, whether in Guyana or overseas, in order to ensure that peace, progress, and prosperity returns to Guyana, and that every man, woman, and child, as I keep saying, enjoys a better, prosperous, and peaceful life. Thank you for listening, and let us return once again to the dialogue straight up. Thank you, and goodbye.